We took that company from a $5 million budget to over a $50 million exit in just 4 years. How do we make decisions in times of distress? What does survival look like? What does survival mean? Surviving is obtaining the credit of those that are willing to give you that credit. Just because you have a winning argument doesn't mean you have a winning case. Good morning to everybody. I really appreciate all of you being here. And I wanted to discuss our first topic of the day. I'm the keynote speaker, is survival stories. And survival stories regards real estate bankruptcy, right? Because everybody here is in real estate. And oftentimes, things don't work out the best and brightest ways in real estate investments. But before we get into that, you should know who I am, what I do, and what my firm practices. So again, as I said before, my name is Leo Jacobs. I'm the owner and founder of Jacobs PC. We're a boutique commercial litigation and bankruptcy, restructuring in court and out of court law firm. We have a 10,000 square foot space with about 25 attorneys working for the organization. We principally practice three things: in-court, out-of-court restructuring, corporate transactions, and litigation. My humble beginnings actually began in Bushwick, Brooklyn. If anyone recalls, back in 2008, there was the residential financial crisis. And I was a general counsel to New York Equity Management. And in New York Equity Management, we used to fix and flip 1 to 4 family homes. And I got really, really good at understanding all the facets of what it takes to fix, flip homes, and the legal issues that are attendant to those transactions. I got really good at wills, trusts, and estates for when someone dies. I got really good at bankruptcy law. Got really good at foreclosure law. And I saw an opportunity to do this on a bigger and greater scale. We took that company from a $5 million budget to over a $50 million exit in just 4 years. Not many know this about me, but at about 26, 27 years old, I'm 36 now, I was managing about 40 law firms, about 100 lawyers, all shapes and sizes, all practice areas, and I got really good at working with people. Then I decided I'm going to take this to New York City and start restructuring commercial assets. What's interesting about commercial assets is that, and what I've learned today and I want to talk to you about, is the asset class changes from residential to commercial. But the emotions that are attendant to investing principles with those people does not. What do I mean by that? What I mean is it doesn't matter the asset, but more so the emotions that we feel when we're making these investments. There's 2 lines of thinking when investing into real estate. One is from moving 0 to 1. That means expanding your horizons, expanding your partnerships, expanding your credit facilities, expanding the amount of tenants you have and multifamily units you have or condos that you have. But then there's a subject that not many people understand how to work in. And that is the category of 0 to -1. The negative emotions that you have to take into account when dealing in distress. So let's take an example. One very, very big example might be a stalled condo project that you and your limited partner have begun. You're the general partner. This person is the limited partner. Your budget is $100 million. You began this project in 2012 at the height of when credit was exceptional. 2%, 3% increases, 2%, 3% interest rates, 4% interest rates, 5% interest rates at the max, when everything was open to you. So your hand was very light. You've made decisions quickly. There was no fog in front of you. There was nothing calibrating your decision making other than your own discretion. But something happened along the way. The market turned. Your partner was in a couple of bad deals and now needs his money back. People started suing you. Your construction liens started occurring. The market and the regulations are changing. And all of a sudden, the decisions you've made that got you to a place to handle a $100 million project, all of a sudden, any decisions that you begin to make, they don't equate to better decision making. It's as if that fog that I was talking about is now in front of you. You don't have what to see in order to take action to press your project forward. So what's valuable in this context? What's valuable? Well, if you have very difficult ability to make decisions, who do you go to? Well, you might go to your transaction attorney. You might go to your consultant or your accountant. And for some reason, they don't have the temperament to make those decisions for you because they've been making decisions from 0 to 1. They don't know how to deal when there's a break. And that break is what we're here to discuss. How do we make decisions in times of distress? What does survival look like? What does survival mean? Surviving is obtaining the credit of those that are willing to give you that credit. Those are the people that are not around. So one of the most important things in survival is how to make decisions with a different team. That team is a distressed consulting team. It is a financial advisor. It is a debt restructuring attorney. It is a debt restructuring broker. It is a debt restructuring accountant. It is a debt restructuring team. Well, let's say you have that now and you found those people. You're still dealing with the negative emotions of your project. You don't obtain clarity or you don't have clarity in your decision-making process. For example, you're speaking with your broker and the $100 million condo project today is worth $35 million. And to make matters worse, the value of that project to another individual in a buyer's market is worth even less. Your appraisal is not coming back the same way. Your partner wants their money out. How do you traverse that terrain? Well, there is a magic word or sentence, if you will. It's no longer in a 0 to 1 market how much you can afford to buy something for. It's how much you can afford to borrow and keep going. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if a project is worth $35 million and you have personally guaranteed those obligations and you're going to be set on a negative $75 million personal guarantee, You can't afford to buy. You have to borrow. What do you borrow from? You borrow from your future self. And you say, okay, I legitimately have a problem. I'm going to be liable for $75 million. It seems as though I need to get someone like a Leo Jacobs to start negotiating with the bank, and someone maybe like Greg Corbin, who's a distressed real estate broker, to understand what the value is, right? And David Goldwasser as well. But you need to surround yourself, and you'll hear about those stories today as well, from Greg Corbin, from David Goldwasser, about what's happening in those situations. Many of you, or some of you that don't know, our restructuring team has advised, executed, and restructured on over $5 billion of debt and equity. So we have a little bit of experience about what's happening in the market. We've dealt with all asset classes. We've dealt with condos, multifamily, rentals. Actually, I'll bring up an example of how we moved a distressed asset and its personal guarantee away from an aggressor. Everybody knows probably Madison Realty Capital, Rialto. There's a lot of problems with them. When you try to discuss matters with them, they don't want to talk to you unless you have what's called leverage. Leverage is created in three ways: obtaining more time for the market to get better, obtaining a person or an individual or organization to purchase your note and let you off the personal guarantee, or becoming a resource to the actual operator, effectively the lender, in times of distress. I want to make sure we're good on time. We're good on time. So how do we do that? How do we approach a lender? We don't approach a lender by putting a black bag over them, putting them in our car and beating them up until they listen to us. No, we start a dialogue. The effective way to begin a dialogue with your lender is to begin at the asset level, not at what you believe as the borrower is the value of the property, but what the lender believes the value is of the property. It's about serving or continuing to serve the lender in a way that allows them to understand what they have given money or lent money on. When they begin to understand the asset, then they can begin to understand the borrower. And the borrower could be someone that is a mirror to them in these times of distress. Now, you might say, Leo, that's great. I can apply those concepts and I can apply those principles to speaking with my lender. But what if I have a portfolio of assets that are not doing well? What if the funds that I've placed into a project, my equity, not my debt, okay? Say, for example, again, I'll use a Madison or Rialto. Rialto's willing to let you off the personal guarantee. But how do you get your equity back? The equity that you've placed into that property. Well, you have to look at it from a macro point of view. Macro point of view is to not only look at the asset level of the project, but to understand that in these times, it's important to maybe let go of that project. There was a client, which is a good example, who had a loan with Starwood. And they owed Starwood north of, I think, about $20 million on a personal guarantee. If you read the headlines in the ReDeal, Starwood is going after a lot of these guarantors. But now with our client, what we did early enough is we instituted a communication campaign with Starwood. And we told Starwood that our client is not worth anything. But that's only half the story. The other half of the story is our team's efforts in working with the client to work with the client's ego. So we spoke about value as to the asset level. Now let's talk about ego. I always have the phrase, appraise your greed. What does that mean? On a macro level, if the assets that you are holding are not worth anything, why hold on to them for the prospect of them being worth more valuable tomorrow? So with this client that we had, that had a Starwood loan, the other half of the story is how we introduced the concept of letting go. Letting go in a distressed market is the surefire way to make sure that your value today and your value tomorrow are able to be attained. Because holding on to assets that could prospectively be worth something more tomorrow, when you can let go of some of those assets and feel lighter, is the way to go. And that's what we were able to accomplish with one of our clients. We spoke to that client. We advised that client on a macro level to say, look at your portfolio. Some assets are worth keeping. Some assets are not worth keeping. And ultimately, the client is the one that made the decision. But it is because the client was smart enough to hire the right advisor, look at the asset and the value of that asset, and then ultimately make the decision in the best interest of their company. That is the definition of survival. Understanding that you need to make those decisions in a distressed market with the right people, with the right values and time, and with the ability to ultimately let go. And that is what happened with Starwood. We entered into a communication campaign with them without any litigation. We had a conversation with them. Yes, we did have an aggressive posture. I actually remember having that conversation. Everybody knows Starwood is a $1 billion fund. So Starwood gets in the line, and they're like, look, Leo, we want to talk about how your client is going to give us $10 million to settle this. I was like, it's interesting, because I was going to ask you if your client's prepared to give us money to walk away. So it's about turning the tables on the lender, but you do that sparingly. In our advertisements, we appear quite aggressive. In our advertisements, we appear quite astute and stubborn. But ultimately, it's 1% of the actual equation that is instituted to get the client and the lender over the line. The second thing, or the fourth thing I wanted to talk about, is temperament. When making decisions in distressed environments, your decision-making processes are clouded. They're clouded because you have too much debt, you have too many clients suing you, and you don't know how to traverse that terrain. Allow me to give you a measuring stick. If at the height of your portfolio, you had a $1 billion portfolio, and today that portfolio is worth negative $250 million, don't concentrate on making more money. Concentrate on releasing your obligations. So that is a perspective that does not exist in a market that is expanding. That is only something that is present when the market is contracting. I have another war story for you guys about survival. One of our clients had a $100 million condo project on 35th Street. And many of the people were telling them, you have to let go of this asset. So as you have noticed, I've provided the rule that in a contracting market, let go of your assets. There's an exception to that rule. The exception to that rule is if it's one project that you've placed all of your equity and your family's equity into. That exception is when you can fight to the inevitable personal bankruptcy if you believe in that project enough. Belief, what I like to call the audacity of hope in a distressed environment, is sometimes the only thing you have is to actually fight. So in this project, the family had actually cross-collateralized their personal home, cross-collateralized their vacation home, cross-collateralized their rental home. They've cross-collateralized everything. And they poured over $100 million into this project. The market went down. It's on 35th Street. For those that know, it's not the greatest place to build condos. In fact, there are no windows. So the conditions of the project are dilapidating at its finest. So what is someone to do? How do you find a resolution when, in fact, you have signed away all of your rights? The deed in lieu transaction, you've accepted a receiver, the value is down. What do you do? We fought, because sometimes the only thing you have is time. If you have the benefit of time in a market that is recovering, values change. But there's something more important that changes. The people or organizations that own your note. It happened to be that a prominent family purchased that note of those individuals. And they also thought that the value was there when it was not. So by the sheer ability to stand up when you essentially have no defenses, and to stand in the face of a lender, sometimes, again, this is the exception. This is not the rule. This is not the rule. This is the exception. When you have to fight, your luck begins to change. And in that specific case, it did. And now we're in negotiations for them to have another 2 or 3 years to pay off that note, because the new note holder believed, unlike the previous note holder, that there is no value. So time is important to consider when making distressed decisions. Your team, is what we discussed, is important to make distressed decisions, as well as the people that surround you. The last war story I'm going to discuss is a story about modifying and using bankruptcy as a tool. There was a client who had 10 Texas properties that went into bankruptcy. And to give you some rules of bankruptcy, in bankruptcy, if you file a Chapter 11, you don't have a lot of time to create a successful reorganization campaign. You have roughly about 90 days. And the legislature, when they created this law, they said the following: there's likely going to be a senior secured debt holder. We're not going to allow a single asset real estate case to be in bankruptcy and hold up the process for a year or 2 years. So the time to enter into a Chapter 11 reorganization when all else has failed, you only have 90 days. And to extend your 90 days for exclusivity to create a plan of reorganization, can only be made by extension to the court or an extension in agreement with your lender. How do you create the environment in a bankruptcy context in order for your lender to extend your time to plan a reorganization? Well, one of the ways you can do that is by hiring a broker to talk about the value, by hiring a financial advisor, by discussing your numbers, by hiring a bankruptcy attorney to take you through the process. And you might believe that hiring the right people might get you to do something otherwise quicker, but that's not how often it occurs. Sometimes you have a lender that does not listen to the value, that does not value the relationships of the bankruptcy counsel or the relationships of the financial advisor. So you're left to continue to create leverage. And that's the last thing I want to talk about. Leverage. Leverage is a concept that should also be used sparingly and not constantly and not in someone's face. What do I mean by that? Say, for example, your client and you find a kink in the armor, and that kink is a failure of standing, or they failed to serve you. And all of a sudden, you feel engorged. You have an actual defense to your lender. That is not something you lead with. It is something you save. And it's something that you put into a discussion as, say, 5 or 10% of that discussion. Just because you have a winning argument doesn't mean you have a winning case. And that's something that we want always to instill in our borrowers. Our borrowers are taking the advantage to new heights. And the exception to the rule, again, is when a lender doesn't want to make a deal. If the lender doesn't want to make a deal, and if you are forced to exercise your rights, some of the most difficult decisions you will have to make is to actually continue to fight and take the course that you may lose, because then your demise is definitive. Because although you believe you have a great case, a judge is a third party that may decide against you. So let's review what I hope I have tried to communicate today. When moving from 0, which is homeostasis, to 1, that temperament and those decision-making processes which do not have what we like to call fog are different than when you're going from -1 to 0, because that is when you are inside of fog. And when you are inside of that fog, essentially blinded and making irrational, emotionally negative decisions, you must institute the benefit of time, the benefit of a distressed restructuring team, the benefit of understanding what the value of the asset is at the asset level, and the benefit of borrowing from your future self to say, if I hold on to this asset in my portfolio of assets, will this asset give me the return that I am looking for? Because ultimately, borrowing puts you even greater in debt. So those are the concepts, the principles that one must use to be able to traverse that terrain. And despite what you may believe that you have to be aggressive, stomp, scream, be unpredictable is actually not present. It's through a measured approach that if you find that defense, understand that a third-party judge can always decide against you. I'm going to save one last comment for a little bit later, but I wanted to open up the floor to questions. And I'm sure people do have questions about the process, about what surviving is, about what temperament is.
What happens in a situation where you have a portfolio of 20 assets and one or two of them have to go into bankruptcy? What happens to the rest of the portfolio? How do you traverse affecting your entire portfolio by taking out the bad apples?
That's an excellent question. So what you're intimating is, Leo, I have 20 properties, and I only want to bring in 2 of those properties into bankruptcy. Well, that depends on a few things. Number one, it depends on if you have cross-collateralized your asset to other assets. And that it also depends on what the language of the contract says. If the language of the contract says that if you go bankrupt somewhere else, therefore it'll be a default on all other properties, then you have a few things to consider. Bankruptcy does not occur via filing. So what you may do, let's assume that you have 20 properties, 2 of them need to go, quote unquote, bankrupt. What you do is, and you find out that you're cross-collateralized, and you find out that if you file, you'll be in default. One of the best ways to begin the bankruptcy process is not to file for bankruptcy. It's to prepare for it. And in preparing for bankruptcy, that means 3 things. Number 1, preparing the petition. And in preparing the petition, prepare it with a broker and a financial advisor, because the broker will tell you what the value is. The financial advisor will tell you what you can anticipate in those numbers. And in that educational component, you'll learn if you even want to keep that property. Number 2, you begin after taking that petition to introduce that petition to the other side. Maybe not everything, maybe just the first sheet. That automatically changes the complexion of the people on the other side. They might say, go for it, or they might say, let's have a conversation about it. And their conversation might be, well, we've never looked at this asset in a way that forced us to see the value in it. What do you believe is that value? And ultimately, number 3, being a utility to the bankruptcy process. What does that mean? If you have 20 properties and out of those 20, 2 of them have to go bankrupt, that process of renegotiation should begin with the lender, with you marked in preparing to go bankrupt. And if you do that, one of the most effective ways that you can accomplish your goals is by starting that conversation.
Is the threat of litigation against the lender prior to a bankruptcy or something like that, does that give a developer, GP, LP, potentially some leverage over the lender?
We talked about leverage as the exception to the rule. And often people lead with leverage. But leverage is a little bit like leadership. It has to fall and be in the back, viewing what's happening in the front. Allow me to give you an example. Before exercising leverage, true leverage in the sense of the word that you have an ultimate defense to the proceeding, begin at the asset level first, the value of the property. See if that works. Then look at whether you'd like to keep that property. Go from value to keeping. If after that you decide to keep it, attempt to modify some of the terms in your agreement. And if all else fails, then create a platform where you can exercise your leverage. The reason for that while it may sound logical to begin from a point of strength, what sometimes happens is you are placed in what's called, with the lender, bad form. No one likes to be told that their documents are incorrect, that they're going to lose, and that you're going to win. That is not a fruitful place to have a conversation with your lender. And this is my last thought that I wanted to add. We were talking about being a borrower. We were talking about principally borrowers. But did you know that lenders are borrowers too? So when you're talking to them and they already are borrowing from Paul to pay Peter, because they sometimes borrow as well, putting in front of their face that they now have a serious problem with not only getting their interest back, but getting their principal back, may give them the same exact negative emotions that you're dealing with as well. So let me make a joke. You had a bad day, your wife had a bad day, and the both of you are trying to resolve someone else's problem or your problem. It's not going to work. So diffusing the bomb instead of acting on it is sometimes the best pathway forward to resolution. And sometimes getting the lender to see the value in the asset makes them see that their problems, although there, are not going to be taken advantage of. So it's about applying the rules first before applying the exceptions. Although all of that can happen in the matter of 1 hour or 100 days. And that depends on the case itself.
Question is this. Let's say you're a developer or syndicator and you have limited partners, right? So you're a general partner, you have limited partners. A lot of times they don't want to hear, listen, we're about to, lose money. Nobody wants to hear that. How do you bring them into the fold? It's a two-pronged question where they can understand what you're describing for a general partner. They don't want to hear it. You tell them, listen, this value, the asset maybe doesn't have the value, whatever the case may be. You talk about bankruptcy with them, they automatically, in their head, oh, we're losing money, this, that, and the other. And then if you're in the future want to make deals or develop or do anything of scale, now these people, the limited partners will have a bad taste in their mouth, go out to the community, elsewhere and start talking, listen, this, that, and the other, not understanding the complexities because most of the time they're not in the business. How do you have that conversation with them? Okay. And at the same time saving face or your name?
Our firm, speaking of limited partners, is representing some limited partners in a confidential matter for One State Street. I don't know if you know One State Street. It's the biggest building in Boston. They lost State Bank, and as a consequence of that, Fortis had allegedly defaulted. Okay, and in that bucket, right, there are a lot of limited partners, right? So we're advising some of those limited partners from their side, and these are some of the principles of dealing with limited partners. Transparency from the very beginning with limited partners is some of the most important things you can do. What does that mean? frankly, providing them a pamphlet of all of the ways they can lose their investment. And not only that, in the beginning, which is what we advise our clients, who are GPs speaking with LPs, to invite them to a lunch, to invite them to a Zoom, where you can discuss the consequences of losing your investment. Now you're going to tell me, Leo, I'm about to take $5 million from someone. Well, why the hell would I want them to know all of the bad things that can occur? You're not telling them of all the bad things that are going to occur. You're going to tell them that all these bad things may occur, but these are the things that we're doing for it not to. So dealing with negative emotions or negative consequences, the best way to deal with that is to communicate ahead of time what you're doing to prevent it, so that there are going to be expectations now of what you're going to do. And if you do that and the investment is still lost, you now don't have a LP that is begrudged. You don't have an LP that is ultimately going to say, I didn't know. You never sent me anything. I was expecting this return. And despite what you may believe about treatment of LPs, that's what LPs most often want to know. They don't want the GP to carry everyone on their back. I'll give you another example. We have property on Fifth Avenue where we're also representing an LP. As a consequence of the relationship between the GP and the LP in a social context, drinking, hanging out, the substance of the deal disappeared. It was almost as if the amount of drinking or hanging out was a return on investment for something that was losing money. It got to a point where the general partner could not face or hang out socially anymore with the LP as a consequence of that relationship. So understanding that while friendship is good, understanding how to have tough conversations productively that resonate with LPs is the surefire way that when you do need them to care about you in the event of a loss, that they are there with you putting in money. We like to run our law firm as a client-facing law firm. Decisions come out, the next minute you have the decision. It's good, doesn't matter. It's bad, doesn't matter. You receive a memo. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months before a decision is provided, we give them the update. So ultimately, dealing with an LP is about effective communication and what you're doing to prevent those problems from occurring. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I have an LLC, which I'm the general partner. There's a couple of other investors with me. Where we own, let's say, 25% of a deal out of town, and the main partner, there's no value. We bought it to develop, and it's not happening because many different things happened after COVID. But the partner doesn't want to file for bankruptcy. We just want him to sell and get out, but he's like schlepping, as they say. How can we force him to do something?
Excellent question. So in this context, we dealt with an LP. In your context, we're dealing with a general partner as well.
I'm not a general partner. There's two general partners in LA. The property's in LA. We're all here. These guys are running it. Nothing's happening. We just all want out. We don't expect to see any money, but we just want to close the door on it.
So the appraisal, when you're having a dispute amongst partners, and all of a sudden the value is not there, there's one important thing you have to determine. One important thing. It is, what is the treatment of the value that you've provided into that deal? Is it a debt instrument or is it equity? If it is equity, if it is equity, and there is no malfeasance, mismanagement, fraud, or conspiracy to commit all those things, then you have to value your position. If the value of your equity is negative, you have two options. You either sit and wait or you cut bait.
We already told them we're not coming up with any capital call. It's his all gig.
And that is your right to be diluted. But remember, you asked me a specific question. You said, how do I deal with my position? Oftentimes when equity holders are prepared to make a lot of money, they are not prepared to sit in those distressed situations. We've had 3 or 4 clients that have sat in their positions for 4 or 5 years and ultimately received a 15x return on a $2 or $3 million investment.
Well, in this case, the general partner from LA doesn't think we'll ever see our money back, including his own money.
Last thing you need to understand, and then I have to get off, is your perception of value should be appraised based on the value of the asset, not on the value of the opinions of others. Understanding how to work with the finances, your financial advisor, the things that I've discussed today in our discourse. Understanding and getting the right team so that then you could be in a position to educate yourself, however difficult it is and how much ever money you need to put into it. Because if you're not willing to do that, then you're just as good as the other person on the other side guessing the value of the investment. Ultimately, it's very difficult to exit a project where the perception of the project is negative. But it takes a lot of resilience to stop and say, it's not his fault. Let me help him or her figure out that value. And when you sit down and you do it together, instead of pointing fingers, you hold arms. However difficult that may feel, you get one very, very probable thing that occurs. Companionship. Because if you're feeling like that, they're probably feeling like that. I want to thank everybody for coming in and listening.
Thank you very much.
And hopefully I've been, in some sort of sense, service to you. I appreciate everyone. My name is Leo Jacobs, founder of Jacobs PC. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Leo.